So, welcome, Guy Gaufey. We're going to talk about your book, Lacan and the Formula of Sexuation, which is a translation of Le Patu de Lacan. And I want to start by, first of all, thanking you for talking with me. And I want to jump in with the question about feminine enjoyment and how you see feminine enjoyment relating to Freud's conception of the libido as necessarily masculine. And I wonder, excuse me, if this necessitates rejecting this idea of Freud's as just historical, or is there something right about that actually jibes with the notion of enjoyment as feminine?
Okay, thank you, Todd, for this question, because for me it's a very common mistake, the reading of Freud's text, that of course masculinity and libido are very close, but the question is about not masculinity but activity. Activity has to be understood as the temperature, you know. That is the movement of particles, atoms, and so on. So when you are in the absolute zero, there is nothing under. Okay. And the same for activity. There is only one activity. Okay. Unfortunately, it's true that Freud made a confusion between activity and masculinity, and that is in accordance with his period, the Vienna end of the century. Okay. But if we think of the libido as pure activity, there is only one, of course. Okay. When Jones, at the beginning of the 30s, proposed masculine libido, feminine libido, female libido, Freud, of course, said no, but he was surprised. You know, he is not God, created man and woman. Right. There's only one libido. And it's not masculine, it's active. Therefore, in Freud's time, if active, therefore masculine. Today, no. But activity is to be understood as the property of libido only.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you think that is actually a historical, that's something due to Freud's historical period that he links activity to masculinity. But yes, it's absolutely right to think of libido as active.
Yes.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. That I think, you know, I'm always a little wary of giving ground to this historicist explanation, but I think in this case I think that works. Yeah.
History does exist, but logic as well, you know.
Right.
There are logical questions all along my work, and we have not to confuse them with historical data.
Right. So just following up on this, do you see, is the notion of feminine enjoyment a point at which Lacan breaks from Freud? And do you think there are these moments of rupture, even though Lacan, you know, himself talks about a return, his project is a return to Freud? Do you think there are these moments of rupture from Freud?
Yes, of course. There are so many ruptures between them. It's very understandable because on one side we have a Jude in Vienna at the end of the 19th century. On the other side we have a French Catholic during the 30s of the 20th century. So it's absolutely normal. But for instance, I very, very often commented on the fact that about repression, you know, the concept of repression. Of course, there is repression in Freud, and the concept is present in Lacan as well, of course. But what is the agent of repression? In Freud, it's very clear. It's the ego. Okay? Right. Because the ego, the Freudian ego, has strength and capacity to repress ideas. Okay? On the side of Lacan, who is repressing? The ego? Of course not. The specular ego has no strength at all.
Right.
So it's sort of Freudian ego that's repressed on the Lacan side as well. So there is a point of junction between them. And for me, it was quite impossible to read Lacan without Freud. So right. In the Lacanian world, the attempt to read Lacan without Freud is for me a sort of nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are many ruptures because of historical data, but there are also ruptures in the mode of thinking, you know. And
Yeah.
it's very clear with the Borromean knot and the preoccupation of ternarity in Lacan, which is completely absent in Freud.
Right.
Completely.
Right. Right. I think that's right. And I wonder, could you link that to feminine enjoyment? Do you think that that is also a part of one of these points of rupture where Freud just doesn't think it at all?
But as I told you at the very beginning, I'm not very in favor of the expression feminine enjoyment.
Oh,
It's
interesting.
very common, but if I said, oh, feminine enjoyment is this or that, I would agree with a bipartition I don't agree with.
Okay. Okay. So that would be, so you think even that notion of feminine enjoyment succumbs to the Jonesian God made them man and woman.
I
Interesting.
don't know.
Yeah,
In fact,
yeah, that's really
I
interesting.
don't know, but I try to avoid the using this bipartition
Right.
immediately. Okay, and
Yeah.
we can see that with the formulae. It's not I try to call them left and right and not man and woman
Right.
because it's too fast. It goes too fast. You
Yeah.
know, like
Yeah.
your one question you put at me about why X. Why not X and Y for man and woman? Of course, because there is one libido. So if you give to yourself X for men and Y for women, the problem is finished. Okay, it's like in the Bible. God created X and Y.
Right. 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 That's interesting. So the dualism becomes a way of avoiding the dialectical problem, really, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that.
Freud is profoundly dualistic. Profoundly.
Yeah.
He's the man
Yeah.
of the conflict. Okay.
Right. I mean, isn't that I think on the question of drive, that becomes really apparent, right? Like Freud insists always on this duality of the drives, whereas for Lacan, it's like death drive has this absolute priority for him.
Yes, but everybody has to compose with a duality, okay? But Lacan tries to establish a ternarity very soon, symbolic, imaginary, real, and then in a second time with the Borromean knot, it's worse, if I can say that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It's on the mode of Saint Augustine. Okay. It's a ternarity in a very religious way of thinking it. Okay.
Do you think it has
unity through three terms?
Do you think that he's influenced by Kierkegaard at all in that way?
Kierkegaard little, Saint Augustine much more.
Oh, interesting.
You know, one day he said, "I'm not. I don't read Saint Augustine. I practice Saint Augustine."
He really said that. That's
Yes.
that's great. That's really great. Yeah,
that's a big difference, you know.
Yeah, that is a big difference. That is a big difference. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Seminar 7, the ethics seminar.
Oh yes.
And in what sense? I wonder in what sense you think this is a turning point for Lacan. And I'm always been kind of obsessed by the role that Dasting has in his thought and how the extent to which it almost it makes this grand appearance and then it disappears. And even the ethic of desire, he never repeats this notion about giving ground relative to your desire. And I wonder if you think that is it this moment of something bursts out and then disappears, or do you think it keeps echoing in his thought, or what's your take on that seminar?
At first, I must say that I don't like very much this seminar because of its title, you know, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. I'm strongly against this preoccupation of ethics, you know, first of all. Secondly, it's a sort of accident in the series of seminars, you know, just before during the desire and its interpretation, there is the beginning of the constriction of the object A.
Right.
And the subject, of course. And all of a sudden, during 1 year, the ethics of psychoanalysis, the word subject appears I guess, less than 10 times. Nothing about the subject itself, okay?
Right.
About the project, about the l'amour courtois, about Antigone, okay. But the subject, nothing. The first session of the seminar after transference, it's a complete refusal of intersubjectivity. Although in the seminar before, in the desire and its interpretation, it was the most important thing, intersubjectivity.
Right, right.
So there is a complete turning during this seminar about Dasding and the like. But this seminar is a sort of apex, okay?
Yeah.
And not to ne pas céder sur son désir was such a mot d'ordre, such a key word during the history from that time,
Right.
that I profoundly dislike that, profoundly.
Yeah, yeah. So you think it was I mean, it's almost like this point that allows him to get to a different point, but then it kind of, like you said, it is a hapax, but it sticks out, and it's interesting. I mean, that point about intersubjectivity is fascinating because he's so profoundly anti-intersubjective or against the idea of intersubjectivity in his later seminars. And it's interesting to think of Seminar 7 as the hinge that gets him to that idea.
Yes. But what I have against this seminar is precisely its success.
Right. Yeah. So does that mean that this for you, Das Ding doesn't resonate as a concept either, or do you think that there's something salvageable about that idea?
Oh, yes, there is something that we can keep, but I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because I think that the Oedipus complex is so strong in that seminar, and then in the later seminars, he doesn't seem to be as invested in the Oedipus complex as a problem.
Yes, that is why I think of this seminar as an apex.
Yeah.
Something very special. Is included in the series, but it's something very special when you read it comparatively with the one before, the one and the ones after.
Yeah, it's interesting too that if you take Agalma as a precursor of Objet A, it's right after the seminar that he discovers Objet A. I mean, I think because it's still in Seminar 6, even though he does mention it, isn't it still an imaginary object for him?
Yeah, it is still imaginary, but it becomes to be a metonymic object, which is not imaginary. And slowly it will become the object A during the identification in December and then the following months in 62, 63. There's the construction of the object A as itself, that means as partial in a very strange meaning, fictional, and without any image in the mirror.
Right.
So not imaginary. That's the second time of the object A. It's very funny because in the first time, during 20 years, it was imaginary. Second time, it was symbolic. Third time, from 65, it was real.
It's real.
Right. Threat about the object. It is real. And then with the Bromean knot, nothing of that. It's just ectopic. No imaginary, no symbolic, no real. Just in the center of the knot.
So it no longer fits with any of the agencies at all, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
the strongest existence of this object A is out of any dimension.
Yeah, and I think this is clear. I mean, you're in your book on Objet A, I think you make this clear, which I would recommend to anybody. I love that book. So I want to talk about this relationship between this development of Objet A. I mean, I think that's that makes a lot of sense. But I wonder if you could connect it to the sexual non-relation. Like, what role the Objet A plays in that non-relation?
Yeah. I'm used to saying that, or to comment on the il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel as il n'y a pas de rapport, sexual. Because the important point is the establishment of something with which there is no rapport. You saw that in my book in English, I proposed to discard the word relationship, because in the expression, in the usual translation of there is no rapport sexuel, there is no sexual relationship, is just a stupidity, you know?
Right.
It's not a negation of fucking. It's a question about le non-rapport. Okay? And the object A, as proposed in the identification, is partial, is said partial, in the sense of something incommensurable, like racine carrée de 2, square root, what's the name of that? Square root of 2.
Oh, the square root of 2. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So it does exist, but we can't. The Greeks cannot construct it arithmetically speaking. Okay. That's the point with which Lacan constructs his object A as out of any imaginary data. Okay. We cannot construct it. So the partial is to be understood as no relationship with the unity.
Right.
So the story of the no relation, le non-rapport, begins, for me, in 1962 with the invention of the object A.
Yeah.
And years after, it becomes non-rapport sexuel, which is more complex. Okay. But the beginning of the non-rapport is really the construction of the object A in the seminar, the identification.
Interesting. So it's real. So you see the non-rapport developed in seminars 18 through 20. That's already, the origin of that is in the development of the objet A.
Yes, but I have another comment on this point. Okay. Because in my opinion, Lacan realized at the beginning of the 60s that with his definition of the subject as represented by a signifier for another signifier, he has proposed and defined a kind of relation completely crazy. Anything with anything. For a philosopher, for instance, there is the order of reasons. You can relate something with something else if there is any reason between them. Okay. But with the definition of the subject, according to Lacan, it's completely crazy. He recognized that years later, when he commented on the book of Abraham Turok about the verbier de l'homme au loup. Maybe it's not very well known. There was an introduction from Derrida, okay? Because it was a comment on the wolf man between 4 languages, Russian, German, French, English. Okay? And they passed, the author passed on from one word in one language to another word in another language, and so on and so on. And Lacan said, I must confess that I'm the culprit of that. It's my fault.
Oh, interesting.
And it was the result of such a definition. If the subject is really what he proposed as subject, of course, there is nothing inside one language. All the languages are good. Okay.
So about what year was it?
So, sorry, but in front of such a possibility, he has to invent the non-rapport, because the rapport was everywhere with everything. Okay. So the construction, in my opinion, the construction of the non-rapport is an internal necessity in Lacan's teaching.
Interesting, and you see it as it came out of this sense that the subject, the signifier represents the subject for another signifier. That problem with that definition of the signifier leads him to the non-rapport.
Indirectly, yes, because it was this definition is too much. You know, it's crazy.
So what year was that review or his response to that book?
Sorry.
What year that was?
It was in 1962.
1962. Okay.
1962. The identification. When he put the object as partial, as incommensurable, you know, that was, and in my opinion, it was also an answer to the subject of the to the success of Melanie Klein in Paris, because the object relation is an invention from Klein. And immediately, Lacan had a seminar, La relation d'objet.
Right. I think, I think it's true. Like his like so much of his development is in response to the success of object relations, right? Like I think.
I guess so. Yes.
Yeah.
But the difference of meaning is given with the arithmetic conception of an object, such as square root of 2.
Right, but also, you've mentioned this already, that it seems like in response to object relation, there's a kind of duality to that position that, he introduces that third party, I think, that seems like the decisive move contra object relations, right?
Yes, indeed. There is always a duality when you construct something, you are confronted with dualities.
Right. Okay, so you speaking of duality, you say that the formula do not represent a duality, and so I wonder how we can think of a relation or should we not think of any relation between the two sides of the formula?
No, the little criticism I had in this book about Jacques Milner was about his way of reading this formulae as a linguist. The pertinent feature is present or absent. Infinity, not infinity, tac. So it's not the way, in my way, to read correctly this construction from Lacan. Lacan constructed it when he fell upon the paper from Brunswick about the another logical square, the one Aristotle discarded. When he encountered that, Lacan had, out of the blue, the pattern of what he wanted to construct as the non-rapport. So if you are stuck in a duality, presence absence, X or Y, and so on, you are going to miss the point to construct a duality from something which is not, at the beginning, a duality.
Right.
Okay. So the same letter, X, for the two sides, and another logical square where truth is not on left or on right, but on bottom or top. Right. So that is difficult to imagine without the blackboard.
Right. It's hard. So there's not a passage from one side to the other in your way of thinking?
No.
Okay. So that's exactly if you think of the non-rapport, that's what the non-rapport means, that you can never, it's not like I think Slavoj has sometimes said that masculinity is a response to the failure to the structure of femininity. And I wonder, I think from what you've written and said, I don't think you would think that's right.
No, absolutely not. But you're talking about Zizek?
Yeah, Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah, but he's a Hegelian, all the time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so I want to talk about the universal quantifier now, and I thought you made this fascinating point that Lacan forms the universal quantifier through the denial of the existential quantifier, and I wonder if you could just maybe unpack this for me and just.
It is just a propriety of the logical square Aristotle discarded, because in this logical square there is not an implication from the universal to the particular, affirmative, but a contradiction. So, for instance, Lacan was not the first one to invent that. I noticed in the book that in 1966, a French logician, Robert Blanchet, published a book, Structure logique, when he described the functioning of a logical square with a particular affirmative in contradiction with the universal affirmative. Okay? So it's not special to Lacan, but Lacan give an utmost importance to that. Okay? In the Kierkegaard way, let's say, the existence is much more than the universal.
Right, right. And that is interesting, because I think that is that seems like an anti-Hegelian and Kierkegaardian kind of move, right?
Yeah, but it's a current, Lacan is, in my opinion, it is trapped in the existential tradition, you know, Pascal, Kierkegaard, and so on. Okay.
And Sartre especially, right? Like, I think he's, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that not as much as, I don't think enough has been made of Lacan's debt to existentialists, that whole existentialist tradition. I absolutely think that's right.
No, but there is a difficulty in France and in Paris because existentialism is something well known through Sartre.
Right.
So it's Lacan disliked that very much.
Right.
So he never talked about existentialism as something of his own. Never.
Right.
But in fact, the ambience in Paris, I don't mind about that.
Right. I mean, in fact, he even is explicitly rejected because he didn't want, because Sartre called what he was doing existential psychoanalysis in Being and Nothingness. And so Lacan explicitly rejected that I'm doing something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's pretty interesting. So you think there's a real anti-universalist thrust to what Lacan is doing in that way?
Sorry?
Do you see a real anti-universalist thrust to his conception of subjectivity and psychoanalysis? Or not?
I don't see how to answer to this question.
Well, I guess my question is about the relationship between, does he see universality as explicitly a problem for the singularity of the subject and its desire? Like, does he see this? In other words, yes, that's my question. Yeah.
Yeah, but there are at least two kinds of universality. For instance, Milner, once again, speaks about good universal and bad universal. Okay, but by itself, it's not enough for me. You have to read the universal in its proper logical square, because they are very different. Okay. So Lacan was against the scientific universal. That is the proposition where if it's true for all objects, of course it is true for some objects. Okay.
Right.
It doesn't work this way in the Freudian field. Okay. It's not because every dream is the fulfillment of desire that we have to see every dream like that. You know, it's not the right connection. Okay.
Right.
On the contrary, one dream can go against this possibility. That is much more interesting. And the case, unfortunately, in the psychoanalytical field in general, the case is put to illustrate something of the theory very quietly, very with humility and so on. But the important thing is the universal. For instance, in Winnicott, the fear of caving in, you know. So a case to show how true it is.
Right.
No doubt. Okay, but this functioning is precisely the scientific functioning, and we don't have this possibility in the Freudian field, in the treatment as well.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, I love that notion that analysts using cases have been guilty of this kind of scientific universal. Like they take the case as a particular illustration of some universal idea. Yeah. I think that. I mean, it's hard to say that I've read a case. It's a study that doesn't do that. I mean, so many do that. I think, and even, don't you think even Freud, like when he talks about dream symbolism, he kind of falls into that same kind of thing.
Yeah, it's another problem. When he introduced that in an edition I guess in 1923 or something like that, he introduced a lot of symbolism, partly because of Jung, partly because of readers of the interpretation of dreams. But it's very strange and very difficult to comment on, because it's a mix between the Freudian way of analyzing dreams, which are very clear in the first edition, and the fact that precisely every dream is not necessarily connected with the Freud way of treating it.
Right.
So he introduced, because it's very odd, very bizarre, any dream, so that sometimes, he said that from the very beginning, sometimes there are true symbolism, a very simple symbolism, umbrella, and that's it. Okay. So he introduced that to come to get something more complex.
Right. Right.
Okay. In the way of the particular.
Right. Yeah, that's for sure.
Against the universal law.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That makes sense. So I wonder, you mentioned a couple times Milner's point about the limit in understanding the non-rapport in terms of a relationship to a limit. And I wonder, and I think a lot of people have, at least I know people that I know in the States have that has been a way of understanding this notion of infinite and finite. And I wonder if you could talk about why that's like the feminine has no limit, the masculine has a limit, right? Like that's the common, I think, way of.
What I don't like that much is that the using of only one concept, limit, present or absent. Okay, it's easier, of course. I should recognize that it's largely easier to have one concept, present or absent. So you re-encounter the duality without any problem. But that's the question of phallus, present, absent, or the penis. Okay, that's the same for me. So I can't say it's wrong. No, it's not wrong, limit or no limit. But it's a wrong basis to describe correctly the difference of the sexual difference. Because it starts from a sort of beginning where it's already done.
Oh, that's interesting. So the problem with that conception is that it starts with where it needs to get to.
Yeah.
You could say, yeah. So you think it's actually in keeping with this initial conception of it's there or it's not. Like that's the
yeah. I prefer something more tricky at the beginning. Okay.
Like, so the beginning is for you more of a problem, not like there's not finally just it's not already decided. I guess that's the thing.
Yeah, the problem is starting from one property, something which is one, how to get a duality.
Right.
Formally speaking, for me, that's the problem.
That is the problem.
If you start from a duality, you will encounter very easily another type of duality.
And so this is why, it's another thing I was going to ask you, this is why Lacan insists on using the same variable on both sides, right?
Absolutely.
And that's tied in some way to Freud's notion, tied essentially to Freud's notion that libido is not.
Exactly.
Yeah. The libido is not sex.
There is a very common thread in this direction, okay?
Yeah. So even though Lacan strips away this notion that the libido is masculine, he still keeps this idea that there's only one libido, and that's evidenced in the fact that there's X's on both sides, right? Like that, it's not X and Y.
Yeah, but if you say only masculine, immediately there is the word and the concept of feminine. If you say active, inactive is nonsense,
Right. No, I love that idea. I mean, it's interesting too that Freud himself says you can't. He even says you can't describe. Do you remember this? Where he says you can't describe masculine and feminine as active and passive, even though we try to do this.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which he was kind of stumbling at the point that you're getting at, right?
Absolutely, because he had the notion of pulsion, of drive, as only active, of course.
Right, of course. Right.
There is no negative activity of the drive.
Right, right. Yeah, I love that. I think that's such a good point. I think it's such a good point. I want to come at the end here to this question of universality. Back to this question of universality, and I wonder if the formula are a rejection of universality. Like I want, like, part of what I think is that one thing psychoanalysis suggests is a kind of that universality is on the side of non-belonging. And I wonder if you don't think that you think that there's a way in which that there's no possible universality of non-belonging.
I published a paper in the Candidate about belonging, including. Okay, it's very different. Okay, in logic, but the formula A has not a rejection of universality. It's a way of using a certain kind of universality. Nobody can reject universality. Okay, if you want to think anything,
right.
You have to use of a universality, of course. So it's not a rejection, but it's not an agreement with the common value of universality in this, what I call the scientific meaning. Okay, some because all.
Right, right.
Because I insist in the book on another value of the word some in our languages. You know, if I heard that on the radio that there was a plane crash and some people, some passengers are still alive, I immediately understand that some other are not so alive. Okay, so
right.
some are alive is true, and some are not is true too. So the two particulars are true at the same time.
Right.
It's quite impossible in the Aristotle logic square. Okay, so this value, this common value of the word some in our languages, gives the intuition of the patou. Okay, because at that time, both particular, affirmative and negative, are patou. Pas sont morts, pas tous sont vivants.
Right, right.
And it's wrong that all of them are dead or all of them are alive. Okay, so the universal are wrong, both of them, and the particulars are true, both of them. And that is the new meaning in the new logical square, where some has another value than in the scientific law, where if some are not true because all of them are true.
So that for Lacan and for you, I think that there's no way to group those particulars together into so like not universal in the scientific sense, but universal in the political sense. There's no way to group those together because, I mean, in a certain sense, that's what the formula are saying to us, right? That there's always going to be some kind of division or split between them, right?
Yes. It's a way. It's an affirmation of the sexual difference. Okay, so there are two very different parts, but they are constructed from one value.
Right, and so it's in some way that one. The question is how that one value gives birth to these two separate.
Because the functioning on left is different from the functioning of right. You know, and that is why I comment on the universal negative. That is the point of invention from Lacan. You know, naming the universal negative. Not all of them are wrong, for instance, but no one to be right.
Yeah, that's really great. You note in the book this movement from there is no rapport to there is a non-rapport.
Yes.
Non-rapport.
Yes.
What's at stake in that? What's that?
It's a long story. I will try to make it short.
Okay.
Because when Lacan proposed the Borromean knot, I attended those seminars during the 70s, and I didn't understand why he was so interested in the fact to establish that there is only one kind of knot. I wondered, but why? Why is he so interested in such a something like that? Okay. During years and years, I did not understand anything until the 9th of January 1979. That day, he said in a very short seminar, because he was not that talkative at that time, he said he had a question he has asked to Pierre Souris, the one who was the Borromean guy.
Right.
And Souris had told him that no, there were two kinds of Borromean knots. I'm not interested in the question to know if there is one or two, but that day, Lacan said, I must confess that given that there is not only one, the fact that I said there is no sexual rapport is just something what I said. Because he hoped that if he could show the one Borromean knot, he could be, look at that. That is the non-rapport. Why? Why? Wait a minute. Because before, rapport means that. Okay? You see?
Yeah.
That's rapport. And that is in the definition of the signifier chain. One signifier, another, and they all each other.
Right.
But when he introduced the Borromean knot, there was a new kind of link, which was not that. And silently, the word rapport began to mean this. And the Borromean knot began to mean non-rapport. So, non-rapport was not only the negation of rapport, it was not anything. It was something very special, the Borromean knot.
I see. So there il y a un non-rapport is, yes. It's only with the knots that becomes affirmed.
Yes, that was the hope, Lacan's hope. And that failed, that caved in 1979, because he accepted that there was at least two different, so he couldn't show any one kind of selling or telling that is the good one. Okay.
Right.
It's very strange. The construction is very strange from the beginning to the end. But that, in my comment on this, the way to understand why the non-rapport, which was only the negation of rapport, became something else. Le non-rapport. An attempt to describe the link between man and woman,
right?
But not like that, but like the three ropes, okay,
right?
Knotting as in the Borromean knot.
Right. So it becomes a way. He's trying to figure out a way to describe the rapport without as a non-rapport, right? Like that's what he's basically trying to do, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very. He did that very silently. There is not any time where he said, before I named up. No, never. So reading carefully these seminars, I began to understand that. I attended these seminars. Yeah. I didn't understand anything of that kind during this period. But years later, I said, well, okay. It passed from one meaning to another meaning. And if you have this hypothesis in mind, it's very convincing.
Yeah. It's absolutely convincing. But I wonder, does he ever say, I used to think this and now I think this? He almost never says.
Sometimes today I was a fool to think this way. For instance, he said, I talked about the signifier chain. It was a stupidity.
Right. Right.
But it's very scarce, very
Right.
scarce.
Scarce. I was thinking, we talked earlier about Seminar 7. He never goes back and says, well, that whole ethics of psychoanalysis was a mistake. He never says that.
No, I can understand now with the age, with my age, that he always forgot his own seminars.
Yeah. That's a fascinating point. I think that's probably true.
Of course, 27 years,
Yeah. I know. I rather than forgetting, I would just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. That's what I noticed myself doing. But anyway, hey, Guy, that's a good point to stop on. And thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks to you.